Lamed Beis Ches has Parshas Haazinu. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal "B'handchil Elyon Goyim." When God gave the world to be apportioned by the nations of the world, Bafrida ben Yodam, and we divided mankind. Yatzik Vulas Amim, he set the boundaries for the nations. Lemispa b'nei Yisrael, according to the numbers of the Jews. What does this mean? So Rashi over here explains. When Hashem initially had divided up those who angered him, their portion, when he punished them and he dispersed them. B'afrida b'nei Odom, when he separated mankind, initially the Torah tells us during the time of the Tower of Babel, they had built a tower to rebel against Hashem. They all had spoken one language. The whole world spoke only Lashon HaKodesh Hebrew. And by confusing their language, this was the basis why their project was disrupted, and he dispersed them. And this is the beginning of language. In each family, there were 70 families. Each family spoke another language. This was the beginning of 70 nations. Each family became another nation. Really, Hashem could have destroyed them totally. He didn't do that. He established them, he maintained them, he did not destroy them. Why? We'll see. Because of the numbers of the Bnei Yisrael, since the Jewish people come from Shem, and Shem was one of the groupings of families who were part of the rebellion. So he didn't destroy them because Shem was among them, and since ultimately Klal Yisrael had to come from Shem, so that's why he couldn't destroy them. And the number was 70. And as it says, when Yaakov had gone to Egypt, he went with 70 members of his family. So the number was 70. Therefore, initially, he established them as Shivim Loshon, 70 languages. They're called Sivim Loshon. So I discussed this on Rosh Hashanah. He doesn't say Hitziv Gulas Amim Shivim Amimim, 70 nations. He refers to them as Shivim Loshon, 70 languages. Okay? Now, in the Musaf, whenever we refer to Atav V'chartam, we call Amim. How do we refer to the nations? V'romamtonu b'kol halashonos. Hashem exalted us, elevated above all the other lashonos. So refer to lashonos. Here it says, Hitziv Vulas Amim, he set the boundaries of the nations, Shivim Loshon, which corresponds to the Shivim Nef. Member family went to Egypt, which was the beginning of what? Of our nation. That was the involvement, ultimately, to become a Klal Yisrael. We went to Mitzrayim. Why does Rashi say Shivim Amimim? Shivim Amim, 70 nations. As he says, Hitziv Vulas Amim, Shivim Loshon, 70 languages. Why languages? Vermam Tonal Kol Hashonos. They're identified as Lashonos, Loshon. Now, we had read earlier, a few parshas back, that Moshe Rabbeinu had taken the Torah and he had written it Be'er Heitev. What is the word Be'er Heitev? An elucidation which was a very great level of elucidation. So Rashi cites the Medrash, which is based on the Gemara, that he had written the Torah in 70 languages on the stones. On the stones by Grizim Harevo, he had written on the stones of the Mizbeach, the Torah Be'er Heitev, 70 languages. Then why did Moshe Rabbeinu interpret the Torah into 70 languages? The Torah is for us, it's not for the world. That's number one. And what do we need 70 languages? So we once had spoken, when Moshe originally was at the at the burning bush, and Hashem had said to him, I want you to go to my agent, as my agent, to be the redeemer, to be the goel. What was one of the things Moshe Rabbeinu had said? Chvad peh, chvad loshen anochi. I'm a person who has a speech impediment. I stammer. How can I go and speak to Paro if I stammer? So the Midrash says, this is what Moshe Rabbeinu said. Paro had 400 entrances to his palace. People came from all over the world, representing all the nations of the world, which are 70. Paro had 70 interpreters in his palace, that wherever that person had come from, whatever language he spoke, there was an interpreter in the palace to interpret that language. For Paro to understand. He says, I'm coming as the agent of the Creator, and I stammer. Forget about them understanding the language, but I stammer. It's a chil Hashem. It's a disgrace for the one who I'm representing. So Hashem says to Moshe, Lisam Pel Odom, right? Who gave man the ability to speak? Right. This is what Hashem says to Moshe. What are you worried? Lisam Pel Odom. So the Midrash tells us, Odom Arishon, when Hashem created Odom Arishon, who gave him the ability to speak 70 languages? Did anybody teach him 70 languages? He didn't go to Berlitz to learn, to learn language. I mean, so how did Adam Arishon know 70 languages? But he knew 70 languages. So what are you worried about? If you're going as my agent, you'll be able to speak articulately any language that has to be spoken. You'll be fully versed in all languages. What are you worried about? So the question is like this. Why was Adam, without anybody teaching him 70 languages, why was he able to speak 70 languages? Now, we've mentioned the Midrash many times. What is the blueprint for existence? Anything that exists within existence, it only exists because it's necessary, has relevance to the Torah itself. Istakul b'reisa b'rei alma. So that you have 70 languages, that is rooted in the Torah itself. That's part of the totality of Torah, because if Torah is the basis for creation, because creation is the setting for the Torah itself, that means within Torah is contained 70 languages. That's Istakul b'reisa b'rei alma. Before Adam had eaten of the Eitz Hadas, the Chazal tell us, Adam radiated a radiance which had a semblance of Hashem's radiance. And it says, Robi Sofa Olam at Sofo. He had a level of clarity. There was nothing he did not understand. Anything within existence he understood. And that's why he was able to name the animals. Because he understood, as Reb Chaim Volozhin explains, Nefesh HaChaim, that when he gave names to the animals, he just didn't put a label on them. He understood exactly the reason, their makeup, and the reason why they exist in terms of totality of existence versus the Torah itself. Because he saw from one end of the world to the other. So if language or anything else that exists is part of the Torah, and he had that level of clarity, therefore he was able to speak 70 languages. Moshe Rabbeinu, you being my representative, to be the Goel, you have that level of attachment to me, you have that level of understanding. Once you have that level of understanding, it's not a problem. Therefore, it's Lashonos, it's the language. You know the 70 languages. The 70 languages, so when Moshe Rabbeinu had written the Torah in 70 languages, bear hativ, to indicate and to confirm that whatever exists, the 70 nations, which are identified by the languages, all that is part of the Torah itself. They exist because that's a necessity for the application and the actualization of the Torah itself. That's the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was told to record the Torah in bear hativ in 70 languages for that reason. That's the way we explained it in the past. So the reason why there's 70 nations is Misbah Bnei Yisrael, because there were 70 individuals who had gone with Yaakov to Mitzrayim. This was the beginning of the involvement of Klal Yisrael. So they with Shivim Loshon, the Loshon, the language, that each one has its unique characteristic of language, which we once discussed them in Maral, that's an expression of what they represent. Therefore, it's Lashonos, it's language. Therefore, Ramam Kala Lashonos. Hashem elevated us for more than the languages, because the language represents the essence of the nations itself, the culture is rooted in their spiritual makeup, which expresses itself through language. That's the understanding. So over here, there's a very interesting Orach Chaim HaKodesh. And he asks a question. We find that every nation has an archangel. Like we find earlier, when we left Egypt, it says, when Paro was pursuing us, it says, Umitzrayim nosei achareim. Egypt was traveling after them. So Rashi cites the Chazal, it should say, Mitzrayim nosim in plural. Why is it in singular? Mitzrayim nosea, which is singular. So Rashi cites the Medrash. It was what? It was Soro Shel Mitzrayim. It was the archangel of Egypt was traveling after us. That the nation is only functional to the degree that the archangel exists. If the archangel is defeated, the nation falls. So they saw the archangel, meaning the spiritual power behind the nation. That's Mitzrayim Nosei Achreim. The archangel of Egypt was traveling. So when Hashem divided 70 nations, there was 70 archangel. Each nation has its own archangel. That's what it has. So the Or Chaim HaKadosh, this pasuk asks a question. If you have a Mokros Kadosh Chumash Pirish, Shlo Osa Hashem Kol Umos Biatzar Echod Elefridom. All 70 nations aren't under the auspices of one archangel, but rather each nation has its own archangel. V'notza Chelek V'Sar V'Sar. Each nation has its own sar, has its own archangel. Ofan Chaluka Shosabhem Kishiyatziv Geulam. Initially, when he set up the boundaries of 70, each one has its own uniqueness. Hoitzil Misma Bnei Yisrael Pirish Yeshla Das Kim Komaser Hashem Osazer Lumazer Tovera. There's always a corresponding factor, good versus evil. There's good on one side of the equation. There's evil, corresponding factor, corresponding to the good. All the neshamas emanate from two trees, meaning in the spiritual sense. One tree is good, one is bad. Initially, when Hashem created Adam, and he had infused him with that soul was a pure soul. There was nothing, that soul wasn't tainted to any degree. Elon Harahu Samach Mem Odom B'lial. What's the Elon Ra? That's the representation of the Sitra Achra. It's so negative, we don't even pronounce the name. Samach Mem. Ushechota Odom Rishon V'nisari V'Rabetov. When Adam sinned and he ate of the tree of knowledge, which is Tov Hara, and he caused this intermingling of good and evil, when that happened, he started to produce souls that were tinged with evil. Those souls were tinged with evil. Until finally there was a neshama which came into existence, which was pure, and all pure neshamas emanate from that one neshama. Who's that? And this tree of spirituality, if so, was established anew. So Yaakov Avinu, Olav Shalom, it's Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu reached a level of purity that he had a soul, that his soul was a pure soul. Omro, Shufra de Yaakov Avinu, and Shufra de Odom de Kadmo. We had this Gemara in Bava Metzia, that the beauty of Yaakov was a semblance of the beauty of Odom Rishon, V'ovein Hadvarim, meaning that just as Adam's soul before he ate of the Eitz Hadas was pure, it was not tinged with any evil, Yaakov, his radiance emanated from that pure soul, which had a semblance of Adam's soul before he ate of the Eitz Hadas. Okay? Vilon Yeshlo Shivim Anofim. And this tree had 70 branches. It says, Yaakov went to Egypt with Shivim Nofesh, 70 souls. V'im Shivim Nefesh Yodu L'Mitzrayim. Asher al Kain, Kasher Hifrid Hashem Umos. Therefore, when he established the nations, 70 nations, which have a representation of the soul, which is tinged, which has a representation of evil, Hitzav Gulam L'Mis B'nai Yisrael. Also, them Shivim Kineged Shivim Anfi Kedusha. This is the corresponding factor. That is the representation of evil, the 70 nations, versus the 70 Nefoshos, which emanated from Yaakov. That's the 70 versus 70. Hakavona Bezer, he says, what was the intention? That ultimately that every representation of Kedusha, which are the 70 souls, they should dominate the evil, and they should totally dominate it and subsume it. Quotes a posuk in Mishlei, the legs will go down to Moves, Sheraglaim shel Kedusha, Dorchem al Rosh HaKlipa. That as one tramples on something, the Kedusha will dominate totally the Tumah, the impurity, the nether forces. The Klipa is always referred to the husk. The no concept that the branches of Yaakov will dominate and control and dictate the nations of the world. This is ultimately why Hashem L'melech Am Koloretz. It's only through Klal Yisrael, as we say, a king is only a king if he has a nation. We are Hashem's people, and the 70, which initially emanated from Yaakov, we are his representation, and that's why Hashem L'melech Koloretz. As Hashem dominates the world through us, they are under our control. You know, it's interesting. The Gemara tells us in Brochos, the famous argument between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon Yochai, what is the prescription of life? Rabbi Shimon Yochai says that if a person would engage in the agricultural process of the world, Torah Mateoleh, when would you have time to learn? Torah Mateoleh, if you plow in the plowing season and sow and reap and so on and so forth. So how are you able to earn a living in Kemach Torah? He says, all our physical chores will dictate through others. The non-Jews, they'll attend to our physical needs. And they'll happily do it if we're at that. So Shmuel asks him, but it says in the second parsha of Kriyishma, you'll bring in your own harvest. So Shimon says that's Eno Osam B'Torah Shel Mochel. The second parsha of Kriyishma is speaking where Jews are not towing the line. They're not truly doing the will of God. Therefore, we have to do it ourselves. But if we would be doing the Ratzon Hashem, the will of Hashem, our physical amenities will be provided by others. They'll plant and they'll reap and they'll do whatever has to be done. What is that? But that's exactly what he's saying. That ultimately, what is the objective of the world? That the nations of the world, their value is they have a relationship with Hashem through us. By doing our bidding, by accommodating our needs, that we should be able to be fully focused on serving Hashem and advancing our spirituality. That is their value. And this is the concept of 70 of 70. He says, Shiraglaim shel Kedusha dorchem al Rosh HaKlipa. V'nimtso advei Yaakov sholtim umolchim al umos. That the branches of Yaakov, they dominate and they lord over all the nations in the world. You know, Shlomo Melech, he made a very big mistake. The Torah says that a king is not permitted to have more than so many wives. And Shlomo Melech married women representing all the nations of the world. He married Basparo, he did different things. And the Torah says, Lo Yarbeh Lo Noshim. So he believed that because he was Chocham Mikol Adam, he was the wisest man who ever lived, because the Torah tells us, why should a king not marry more than so many wives? Because they can influence his heart. And he felt he couldn't be influenced because he surpasses all that, because he's Chocham Mikol Adam. But he made that mistake. But what was the objective? Why did he want to marry all these women? Because every one of those wives represent every one of the 70 nations of the world. He thought it was the time of Achres HaYom, holding by the end of time. It's time that he's that king who rules the world supreme, as the Gemara tells us. He was Molech B'Tachton Be'Elyonim. He ruled the terrestrial and the celestial, and therefore he thought it was a time that he was permitted and had no relevance to him, but he made the mistake. It did have relevance to him. And ultimately he was influenced. Shlomo. But the concept was this concept here, that since he has the representation of the 70 Anofim, the 70 branches representing Yaakov, he was in the position to dominate the world. And ultimately that the world, every representation of those 70 of the nations should be totally dedicated to facilitate whatever physical needs the Klal Yisrael has. But it's based on this concept, which he's discussing over here. Listen to Pirush Tam Luzer. She'umos she'ashebochlo Hashem shehu Moshe Aleleo Him Yisrael. The nation which Hashem chose to dominate the world, that's Hashem. So it's Kavin Hashem, v'himluch v'nisa es b'nei Yisrael, al kol u'umos. U'bezeh b'kasher hu molech al Yisrael. So therefore, when he lords over us, Hashem is our king, hu molech al kol u'um. Simultaneously, he's ruling over the world, because the world is dedicated to us, and we are chelek, have that relation with him. So ultimately, he rules everything. This is speaking after Kabbalah Torah. Shows Nikru b'shem Am Hashem. That's when we received the appellation of Am Hashem. That's when we became the Goy Kodesh Mamlechus Kohanim.
Rabbi.
1 second. In V'or Hashem explains, we experienced the exile in Egypt. Why did Hashem choose Egypt to be our location? Which there we evolved as a Jewish people. What's the reason? Right? So he explains, he quotes a pasuk in Yechezkel, where Yechezkel refers to the Egyptian people, although it was the height of civilization in Egypt. He refers to them, V'sar chamorim b'sorim. The flesh of the Egyptians are the equivalent of the flesh of a donkey. V'sar chamorim b'sorim. So Maral asks, what relevance does Egypt have to a donkey? So he explains, in Hebrew, the word chomer means material. He says, of all the 70 nations, the one who's the most devoid of spirituality, which is the bottom of the totem pole regarding spirituality, of the Egyptian people. They're the most physical. Of all the 70 nations, they have the least relevance to spirituality. Therefore, Yechezkel, when he depicts them, he says they are chamorim. Just as the chamor represents chomer, they're almost totally material, physical. We have the experience to be able to rise to the level of ultimately, we had to be put in a setting which there was almost no representation of spirituality. That's why Egypt was chosen. So he explains over there when the world was divided among the 70 nations, the Africans went to Africa, the Egyptians went to Egypt, and every nation had its location on earth. Every location on earth, there's a corresponding spiritual representation in heaven corresponding to that location. And each location has an archangel which sees over that location. Like you have Edom, right? We wanted to pass through the Edomite territory. Edom, that territory reflects the spirituality of Edom. The archangel of Edom oversees that location. And every location has its archangel overseeing that particular location. Therefore, the Gemara tells us in Ksubis, Kol ador b'chutz l'keinu eloka. Person lives outside of Eretz. It's like you have no God. What does that mean? So the Maharsha explains over there that, the only nation that has no archangel is Klal Yisrael. We have no archangel because we have that direct connection with Hashem. That every other angel, all its sustenance comes through that archangel, because that nation cannot have that direct relationship with Hashem, so it goes through the archangel. So when we are in exile, wherever we live, you live in Europe, you live in France, France has its archangel. So whatever we receive from Hashem in the physical world that's filtered through that archangel. So as a result of that, it's Kein Lo Eloka. We're not getting it directly. When you live in Eretz Yisrael, the relationship is direct. Even though we're failing, it's direct. You live in any other location because that location was given to that particular nation, and there's an archangel who oversees that location. Every relationship to Hashem, to that people, comes through that archangel. So everything's filtered through that archangel. So it's equivalent Elo Eloka. You don't have a God because you have that interruption because it goes through that. That's the way the Maharsha explains the Gemara Ksubis. But that's the concept. The world, so every nation has a certain representation of spirituality, more or less. Egypt is low man on the totem pole. And that's why we experienced goals Mitzrayim to evolve to be Jewish people, specifically in Egypt for that reason.
They represent
70
Ra.
bulls corresponding to the 70 nations of the world.
Yeah.
That all the sustenance they get. It's more
Even though they represent Ra, though.
yeah, but they have a purpose. They have a purpose. They exist. Why does Hashem maintain them? They have a purpose. The ultimate purpose is that their value is to address all the physical needs of Klal Yisrael, that we should be fully committed to only spirituality. We should be like what Zvulun was to Yisachar. That's what the world is supposed to be for Klal Yisrael. Just as the Gemara tells us that Zvulun would actually put the food into the mouths of Yisachar, that they didn't have a moment of distraction to be concerned about the physicality. That was the level of lack of distraction Yisachar had, because Yisachar was such a provider. He provided at the ultimate level because he esteemed and valued what Yisachar represented such a degree. He didn't want Yisachar to be distracted. Literally, some es ochel b'fim shel Yisachar. If we would did that special level, that the nations of the world would do the same thing. They would accommodate us at that level, and that is their purpose. That our value is the Yisachar, and their value is the Zvulun. But unfortunately, because we're not the Yisachar, therefore they're not the Zvulun. Everything is turned on its head for that reason.
Am I to understand, Rabbi, then maybe it's just foolish, but when the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians, are there two archangels that are engaged in battle?
Yes. I'll give you an example. Let's talk. The Germans, right? They nearly won they were so brilliant, they nearly won the war. But it's only because there were certain mistakes that were made. Generals didn't follow plans and things, but if it would have been, according to history, if they would have followed exactly the strategies they put in place, they would have won the war. But they didn't. Now, the Germans had scientists, they were geniuses. They this, that. But, other nations also had geniuses. The Archangel of Germany, they have an Archangel, is a very powerful Archangel. The people are only a manifestation of that Archangel, what that Archangel represents. Germany is the antithesis of Kedusha. They represent Amalek. That's what they are. As a result of that, whatever insights and the way they developed and their ability to accomplish, like they took over Europe in no time, they just moved in and took over countries. That was because they were empowered by that Archangel. That Archangel empowered them, but of course the Archangel can only empower them to the degree Hashem allows them to be empowered. But that all was dictated and emanated from the Archangel. That they were able to create such armaments and such advancement in many things. And the people had such a fervor and such a dedicated hate to destroy whatever we represent. That all emanated from the Archangel. But of course, they have choice. Every human being has choice. But the core of what they are, that was the Archangel. So when it was time for them to fall, it was meant to be, they shouldn't follow the orders. Because Hashem, ultimately, he's the puppeteer. If they don't follow orders, then they fall on their faces. And that's why they lost the war.
But to Mark's point, is that Archangel gone now? Because they've been...
No, Germany still, but its wings have been clipped.
And same with
not the power
Rome.
that originally was, as Egypt. Egypt was not the power.
And the Romans. The Romans.
Well, the Romans are not the power.
Right, but we talk about
even though Western civilization is identifies with Rome, right? Where's the seat of Christianity, right? The Pope, he's in Italy. That's Rome. What is Russia? What is Russia? They're Romanovs. The core of Rome, it's not any longer the location. The world was turned, people were displaced and everything else. The Russians represent the Archangel of the Romans. They are Rome. And that's why they were called the Romanovs. I mean, till communism, what was Russia? Right? You had the Greek Orthodox Church, even though it was Greek. but there's Romanov. The Romanovs of Rome. That's Western. That Western civilization is rooted in Rome. Okay, I think we should see a little bit Gemara before check out.